First, thank you, Kazi, and to Bill for organizing this session. I'm really honored to be here. I am basically going to speak, as was mentioned, about state policy in microgrid deployment and development. My slides, I have 10 of them, a lot of material to get through on each of those slides, but will be broken into 5 different key states and the programs that they've been pursuing. So California, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, who am I missing, in New Jersey. And basically I'm planning to speak about the funding opportunities that are currently available or just expired in a lot of those states, and also regulatory developments. At the end of my slides, I'll be speaking, giving a broad overview of some of the many challenges that face microgrid development in particular states and how different state laws vary at the moment, and certain issues that we can expect states to face down the road. So without further ado, to begin with California. So the focus of my presentation is mostly on East Coast states and some of the initiatives that they've undertaken since Superstorm Sandy. But California is unique because of some of the greenhouse gas emission goals that they've been pursuing. California set goals to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 to 1990 levels, and to implement a carbon market that would associate a cost of carbon from the electric sector. It also has set goals to produce 33% of its electricity from renewable sources by 2020, with 12 gigawatts of distributed generation, 3 gigawatts of solar PV, and 1.3 gigawatts of battery storage. So in order to achieve these ambitious goals, microgrids are certainly going to be playing a role, and California is undertaking a series of initiatives to foster the development of microgrid. As far as funding opportunities in the states in California goes, in 2015, February of 2015, California awarded $27.3 million in funding to 10 microgrid projects, and a handful of those were for electric vehicle charging as well, with microgrids winning the bulk of the funding. The Commission offered the funding to demonstrate and promote microgrid technology while encouraging increased private investment. And what was unique about California was that the award recipients were comprised mostly of low carbon projects and high penetration renewable energy technologies, which is somewhat on the forefront as compared to some of the East Coast states. The Commission's intent through award of these projects was to learn from each project and gain a better understanding of microgrid configurations that will help offer the highest value to ratepayers. More recently, within the past 6 months, in March 2016, the California Energy Commission awarded about $5 million in funds to distribution and microgrid automation enhancement programs, and smart inverters and smart meters. And in August 2016, within the past month, the Commission awarded just under $2 million for the planning of a large advanced microgrid in Santa Monica. The project is being developed on a 25-acre community where multiple buildings on contiguous property are to be integrated into a microgrid that uses renewables, energy storage, and EV charging and control. So that's one to stay on the lookout for. As far as regulatory developments, the California Public Utilities Commission issued a paper just about 2.5 years ago confronting the adoption of microgrids, and just this past year in May, the California Energy Commission began work on a California microgrid roadmap, which is an effort to remove barriers to microgrid development. And based on a survey of 119 stakeholders in the state, the Commission is working through 10 major issues that they see as barriers in the law or policy or finance to microgrid development. The top 3 that I'll mention are the lack of policies and regulations that serve as barriers to enable microgrids, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail as we get towards the later slides. Certain interconnection confusion and limitations on microgrids in that regard, and also the confusion regarding utility franchise rights. And I'll explain that in a bit more detail in the slides to come. Currently, California is in the process of initiating a process to develop a roadmap to help the industry commercialize and standardize microgrid products in order to drive down costs for the consumers. And the state plans to hold 4 microgrid focused, in-depth workshops over the course of the next year, year and a half, which is interspersed by working group meetings, and the goal is to have a draft roadmap for microgrid deployment done by March or April of 2017. So that brings us, just going through the states in alphabetical order that I have here, in no particular order, Connecticut. And Connecticut has historically, I guess historically over the past 4, 5, 6 years, been at the forefront of microgrid deployment, in that it was the first state to actually address some legal changes for the deployment of microgrids. But starting off with funding programs, Connecticut was also among the first states, if not the first state, to offer significant funding for microgrids. In June of 2012, following Hurricane Sandy, Connecticut lawmakers established a microgrid program to support local distributed energy and generation for critical facilities. And the law required Connecticut to establish the first in the nation pilot program toward grants to recipients to support these facilities. The Department of Energy and Environmental Programs in Connecticut made its first pilot program award in July 2013, awarding $18 million in funding to 9 microgrid projects. The first project to actually be implemented was at Wesleyan University in March of 2014. This program was divided into 3 rounds of funding. The second round of funding recently concluded, well, actually about 2 years ago, and 2 grants were awarded totaling just over $5.5 million. And interestingly, they were for fuel cell microgrids and CHP plus PV and battery storage microgrids in various cities at critical facilities. What's maybe of interest to the audience currently is that there is an open solicitation where the Connecticut Department has been accepting round 3 applications since December of last year, and is continuing to accept applications for microgrid feasibility studies on a rolling basis, and there currently is no end date to round 3 funding. The department is authorized to make up to $30 million in awards, and there is significant funding that remains. So keep note of that. As far as regulatory developments in Connecticut, I'll get into this a little bit more in more detail in a moment as well. But Connecticut passed a law in 2013 that you see there legalizing various microgrids in the state as long as the power source generates less than 5 megawatts. And the Connecticut law was specific in that it allows the distribution lines to cross public streets without franchise infringement. And what I've been hearing is that the Connecticut law, although it's the forefront of legal developments in the country at this point, there are a variety of issues that it hasn't tackled that have continued to be a problem for microgrid development, such as although the law addresses crossing streets and not infringing on the utility franchise, it doesn't address zoning ordinances, which often in certain cities prevent large-scale mechanical equipment to be placed in areas where microgrid development is of the utmost importance. So that's one issue that we're looking at closely as well. Moving on to Massachusetts. Massachusetts has undertaken a variety of programs. It adopted an aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goal of 25% reduction in GHG emissions from 1990 levels by 2020, and 80% reduction of GHG emissions by 2050. While efficiency and conservation play an important role in these goals, low-carbon distributed energy and microgrids specifically has been called out are important to achieving these GHG targets. So as far as regulatory developments, about 2 years ago, the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, as you can see there in the first bullet of the screen, issued an order requiring each Massachusetts utility to develop and implement a 10-year grid modernization plan, in which case the department specifically called out microgrids as a focus for utilities in updating their 10-year plans. As far as funding opportunities go, there was also a $40 million pool of money that Massachusetts initiated that committed funding to the deployment of municipal-led resilient power systems that use clean energy solutions to protect communities from interruptions in energy services. And recently, that also was essentially divided into 3 rounds of funding. In round 1, which was issued in September of 2014, $7.4 million for 6 municipal projects were awarded in Massachusetts. And along the same time, about a month later, Massachusetts issued 27 technical assistance awards to help municipalities prepare project feasibility studies for the eventual round 2 funding opportunity that took place. Round 2, which was awarded also later in the same year, $18.5 million was released to 13 municipal resiliency projects, 2/3 of which incorporated solar plus storage. And it's my understanding at this point, which may be of interest to audience members, that the department in Massachusetts still has about $12 million to spend in the 3rd round of resiliency funding, although that has yet to be announced at this point. As far as Massachusetts Clean Energy Center programming, there's been a number of initiatives there that I'll just go through briefly. Basically, the Mass CEC, as we call it, catalyzes the development. Its purpose is to catalyze the development of community microgrids, where infrastructure can provide a range of benefits to ratepayers and utilities. And to support these endeavors, the Mass CEC recently commissioned a study to identify the benefits and barriers to microgrid development in the state. And it co-develops and participates in a series of planning meetings with municipalities and other organizations to explore business and financing methods to support microgrid development. Most notably, just recently, there is this Community Microgrid Grant Program, RFI, that recently was released, in which the department sought microgrid companies willing to partner with towns and cities. That RFI closed in February of 2016, but the RFI is anticipated. It's a vehicle that is to be used as a precursor to a RFP, or a request for proposals, offering funding that likely will be going towards community microgrid feasibility studies to be explored in more detail in the weeks ahead. Moving on to New Jersey, a lot is happening in the state of New Jersey. There are a lot of partnerships that are taking place in New Jersey between federal, state, and municipal levels. Beginning in October 2013, as you see there in the first bullet point, the governor of New Jersey allocated $25 million to 146 municipalities, counties, and other governmental units to develop microgrids to enhance facilities that were impacted by Superstorm Sandy. And the funding was authorized to be used for retrofitting existing distributed generation, buying diesel, solar, and natural gas power generators, and retrofitting existing solar panels. Interestingly, the second bullet is a large program that many of you might be familiar with, the NJ New Jersey Transit Grid, which is a partnership between I believe FEMA, Sandia Labs, and the Department of Energy. And it is first of its kind transportation microgrid that's being offered through a federal grant. So what that entails is that basically it's designed to provide a highly reliable power system to support a core segment of one of the nation's largest and busiest thoroughfares in the East Coast, and which was shut down, I think, during the storm for, I think, 11 to 14 days. And the idea is that it will include a natural gas-fired electric power generating plant that's capable of generating more than 100 megawatts of power to keep that system running during electric outages. And to make a long story short, the phase of the planning in which this microgrid is being developed at this point is that there's an environmental impact study, an EIS, that's currently being explored to examine the environmental impacts of building out that microgrid. Funding opportunities, I'll just go through really quickly, as I see I'm running low on time. The New Jersey Green Bank, the New Jersey Energy Resilience Bank, has offered up to $200 million in projects that target microgrid and energy resilience. So currently they're accepting, they're issuing funding, they're supporting projects and there are a variety of different conditions in which the Green Bank is authorized to actually support, to issue funding that I can speak in more detail about maybe offline. But finally, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities has circulated a draft application to be used in a microgrid competition that will offer up to $200,000 for feasibility studies for microgrid development. Moving on to New York, there are a variety of initiatives here that industry is paying close attention to. I see I have 3 minutes remaining to get through a variety of slides, so I'll just be brief. The New York Prize Microgrid competition is probably the largest in the United States, where a lot of funding is on the line. The prize has awarded about $8.1 million in funding thus far, and Phase 2 proposals for funding under the New York Prize are due on October 13th. For anyone that's interested in learning more, I'm happy to speak in more detail afterwards. And the 8 winning communities for the second round will have the opportunity to vie for additional funds in a round 3. As far as regulatory developments, reforming the energy vision, REV, is a large platform that New York announced in April 2014 to basically revamp the state's electric power rules in general, and microgrid will play a part. But basically what the idea is that REV would change the role of utilities in order for utilities to manage distributed energy system platforms, kind of a market exchange where microgrids will be able to compete to serve the grid. So basically what REV is tackling right now, what the New York Green Bank NYSERDA is looking at right now, is how to, the extent to which changes in current rules are needed in order to enable microgrids, and how these changes will actually play out. And I thought we would have time to go through some of these legal issues, but two of the thorniest legal issues, especially that New York is looking at, but all the other states are looking at as well, are number one, should certain microgrids be regulated as public utilities? And the second issue, I'll come back to that in a moment, are whether microgrids infringe on a utility's exclusive franchise rights. So there's a variety of states. I won't go into too much detail, but states are tackling these two issues on a very disparate bases. As you can just see from the slide itself, in New York, for the utility franchise issue, the Constitution prohibits the legislature from actually allowing utilities to establish an exclusive franchise, where that's a little bit different than most other states. As you see in Massachusetts, it's a little bit unclear, but for the most part, a microgrid looks like it would be running in certain types of microgrids, at least, especially those that cross public rights of way, might be infringing on this utility's exclusive franchise territory requirement. Going back to microgrids that are being regulated as or whether or not microgrids should be regulated as public utilities, states also have different definitions as to how microgrids can be structured. So as you can see, in varying states, microgrids are not allowed to cross public rights of way. So often what that translates to is that microgrid developers are trying to, they maybe take approaches to building out their microgrids that aren't actually the most engineering-friendly methods, where they're routing pipes and electric wires through parking lots and adjacent buildings, and there's just a real sense that some of the existing laws haven't kept pace with microgrid development. So Connecticut, as I mentioned before, is in the lead as far as addressing through legal changes microgrid development, and I can talk in more detail offline about specific state policies in that regard. I'll just finish on, there are a number of other legal issues that microgrid development has encountered in the past, but, and I could probably talk for about 10 minutes or so on any of these bullets, but I have about 30 seconds left, as Kazi is mentioning, so you can take a quick look at some of these offline, but the bottom line is that without sufficiently clear state regulatory regimes, financing a microgrid can be prohibitive, as a lot of the costs currently are largely based on accounting for transaction and compliance costs. I was at a conference recently where someone asked a question as to, well, I work in a state that's maybe not at the forefront of microgrid development, what can I learn from these various states? And the speaker said, well, what you should take away from my presentation is that you should just follow the carnage. You should follow the obstacles that other states have encountered in pursuing microgrid development, because there's a lot to be learned from, especially these 5 states and a variety of other states, especially up and down the East Coast, that are at the forefront of microgrid development and whose public service commissions are busy tackling specific issues that are listed on this slide and others as well. So with that, I hope I've made this sufficiently clear, and I'll turn the panel over to Peter.